Picture this: a quiet courtyard bathed in golden light, where a scholar kneels in the dust, tracing precise angles with a stick as the shadow of a sundial stretches slowly across the ground. This wasn't just a moment of idle drawing. It was a classroom. Centuries before blackboards or textbooks, some of the most brilliant minds in history taught geometry using nothing more than sunlight, shadows, and the earth beneath their feet. Why would something as advanced as mathematics rely on such simple tools? The answer lies in a forgotten world of ingenuity, where nature itself was the textbook, and every shifting shadow held a lesson. This was more than just a clever trick. It was a revolution in learning. Medieval scholars didn't just see geometry as lines on a page. They saw it alive in the world around them. The curve of a sundial's shadow became a lesson in circles. The angle of sunlight taught triangles, and the dust at their feet transformed into a canvas for discovery. But here's the surprising truth. This method wasn't just practical, it was profound. By tying abstract concepts to the tangible rhythms of day and night, seasons and skies, these ancient teachers unlocked a deeper understanding of geometry, one that connected mind, body, and the universe itself. So what can we learn from these dusty classrooms of the past? Why did this method fade away, and what secrets did it hold about how we learn? That's the journey we're about to take, through the history of education, the brilliance of medieval minds, and the timeless wisdom hidden in shadows and sand. By the end, you'll see geometry and teaching itself in a whole new light, because sometimes the most advanced ideas aren't found in the latest technology, but in the quiet, patient art of watching the world and learning its patterns. Ready to step into the past and uncover the genius of learning by hand, light, and land? Let's begin. Long before the first parchment scrolls or inked manuscripts, geometry was a living, breathing discipline taught under open skies, where the movement of shadows became the first equations. The roots of this practice stretch back to the ancient Egyptians, who used the sun's path to design pyramids with astonishing precision. Picture a priest astronomer standing in the desert, marking the length of a shadow at noon to calculate the height of an obelisk. This wasn't just measurement, it was sacred science, blending math with the rhythms of the cosmos. The Greeks, too, embraced these methods. Legend says Thales of Miletus used shadows to determine the height of Egypt's monuments, proving that even the grandest structures could be understood through simple geometry and sunlight. By the medieval era, these techniques had evolved into a formal teaching tool. Monasteries, the intellectual hubs of their time, became open-air classrooms where monks traced geometric proofs in the cloister's dust. With paper scarce and expensive, the earth itself became their parchment. A sundial's shadow wasn't just a timekeeper, it was a dynamic diagram, its shifting lines illustrating the principles of angles and arcs in real time. This approach wasn't merely practical, it was philosophical. Medieval scholars believed nature was God's first scripture, and by studying its patterns, the symmetry of a leaf, the arc of a shadow, they were deciphering divine logic. But the true brilliance lay in how these lessons bridged abstract thought and tangible experience. A student didn't just memorize theorems, they watched a triangle form as the sun dipped, felt the proportions shift beneath their fingers in the dust. This was geometry rooted in the senses, where theory and practice were inseparable. And hidden in these shadowy classrooms were profound mathematical truths, principles of proportion, harmony, and spatial reasoning that would later flourish in the Renaissance. So what secrets did these sunlit lessons hold? How did scribbling in dirt lead to breakthroughs that shaped cathedrals, maps, and even the stars? The answers lie in the next chapter of this story, where dust and daylight reveal the hidden language of the universe. In the quiet corners of medieval monasteries and bustling university courtyards, sundials were far more than timekeepers. They were the blackboards of their age. These stone and bronze marvels didn't just mark the hours, they etched geometry into the minds of students with every passing shadow. Take a closer look at one, and you'd find not just numbers, but a labyrinth of lines intersecting arcs, radiating angles, and carefully spaced notches that transformed the dial into a living textbook. Each curve told a story, the shallow angle of a winter shadow teaching acute angles, the long sweep of summer light revealing obtuse truths. Historical records whisper of scholars like Gerbert of Aurillac, the 10th century monk who later became Pope Sylvester II, using sundials to demonstrate celestial mechanics to wide-eyed pupils. Imagine him tracing a shadow's path with a worn finger, explaining how the sun's daily journey mirrored the divine order of the cosmos. For medieval thinkers, this wasn't just math, it was philosophy in motion. The dial's gnomon, that upright spike casting the shadow, became a bridge between earth and heavens. As its dark line crept across engraved curves, students saw proof that geometry governed everything from the tilt of a roof to the orbit of planets. But the real magic lay in how these devices turned abstraction into experience. Unlike static diagrams on parchment, sundials offered geometry in real time, a triangle forming at dawn, stretching into noon, then dissolving at dusk. Students didn't just calculate angles, they watched them breathe. This kinesthetic learning tapped into something profound. The human mind grasps concepts deeper when hands and eyes collaborate. A monk's journal from 12th century Chartres captures this perfectly, describing how novices would kneel beside the cloister's great dial, sketching shadows in dust to predict the next hour, a puzzle of ratios and light that made Euclid's theorems feel as tangible as the ground beneath them. Yet sundials carried a hidden lesson beyond mathematics. Their design often mirrored the medieval worldview, a harmony of microcosm and macrocosm where earthly patterns reflected celestial ones. The concentric circles on many dials weren't just functional, they echoed the nested spheres of Ptolemaic astronomy. Even the materials held meaning, bronze for durability like eternal truths, stone for steadfastness against time's erosion. In an era before printed books, these silent teachers whispered that to understand geometry was to read the language of creation itself. So what happened when clouds rolled in or night fell? The next chapter of this story unfolds indoors, where candlelight replaced sunlight, and another humble tool, the sandbox, kept the lessons alive. Because sometimes the deepest truths aren't just written in shadows, but in the grit between one's fingers. For medieval scholars, the play of light and shadow across a sundial wasn't just a tool for teaching geometry, it was a window into the divine. In their worldview, light symbolized the pure, unchanging truth of God, while shadows represented the flawed, transient nature of the material world. Geometry, with its perfect circles and immutable angles, became the sacred bridge between these realms. Think of a monk tracing a shadow's arc. As his stick moved through the dust, he wasn't just drawing lines, he was mapping the journey of the soul from earthly imperfection toward heavenly perfection. The theologian Robert Grosseteste, writing in the 13th century, called light the first form of all things, the very substance through which God shaped creation. To study geometry through sunlight was to participate in that primal act of ordering chaos. This symbolism ran deep in medieval education, when a teacher demonstrated how a triangle's angles always summed to the same value, regardless of how the shadow stretched or shrank. It wasn't merely a math lesson, it was a parable. The shapes remained perfect in concept, even as their physical manifestations wavered. just as divine truth stood firm amid life's uncertainties. Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary abbess, described light as the living brightness that reveals all virtue, while shadows were the necessary contrasts that made clarity visible. In this light, geometry became a spiritual exercise. Students weren't just memorizing theorems, they were training their minds to discern eternal patterns behind the veil of appearances. Even the materials they used carried theological weight. Dust, the humble medium for their diagrams, echoed biblical themes, man formed from clay returning to earth. Yet within that dust, they inscribed perfect forms, mirroring the belief that divinity could be found in the lowliest of places. A 12th century manuscript from Canterbury compares geometric proofs to the fingerprints of the Creator, traces left in creation for humanity to discover. This wasn't abstract poetry, it was the framework that made geometry a sacred art. When scholars like Boethius wrote that number and measure underlie all harmony, they meant it literally. The same ratios governing shadows on a dial also structured music, architecture, and the motion of planets. So why does this matter today? Because it reveals how deeply interconnected knowledge once was, how math, philosophy, and spirituality weren't separate subjects, but facets of a single luminous truth. The next time you see a sundial shadow, remember, to those medieval teachers, it wasn't just telling time, it was telling a story about the universe itself. Imagine trying to learn geometry with just 3 sheets of parchment to last an entire year. That was the reality for many medieval students. In an age where paper was painstakingly made from animal skins and ink required rare pigments, every stroke of the quill carried the weight of cost. But sunlight, that was free, dust endlessly renewable. This simple truth transformed courtyards and cloisters into vibrant classrooms where mistakes weren't just allowed, they were expected. A student could sketch a perfect circle in the dirt, smudge it away with a sandal, and start again 100 times without wasting a single drop of ink. Historical records brim with praise for this frugal genius. The 12th century scholar Hugh of St. Victor wrote that the earth remembers nothing, yet teaches everything, celebrating how dust allowed perpetual practice without penalty. In the margins of a monastery, ledger from Cluny, a frugal monk noted that training novices with shadows and sticks saved 12 parchment sheets per student annually, precious resources that could instead be used for copying sacred texts. Even wealthy scholars embraced the method. Adelard of Bath, who traveled Europe collecting mathematical knowledge, insisted that the hand learns what the eye cannot see, advocating for physical engagement over passive reading. But this wasn't just about saving materials, it reshaped who could access education. Unlike books or astrolabes locked in noble libraries, sunlight touched peasant and prince alike. A shepherd's child could trace angles with a twig. A merchant's son might prove theorems using the shadow of a market stall. The very simplicity of the tools became their power. No guild controlled the production of dust, no king could tax the sun's rays. This was learning stripped to its essence, where intelligence mattered more than wealth. The tactile nature of the method sparked deeper understanding too. Modern studies confirm what medieval teachers instinctively knew: physical interaction boosts memory. When students felt the resistance of dirt as they carved a hexagon or adjusted a gnommon's tilt to change a shadow's curve, they weren't just solving problems. They were embodying them. A 15th century sketchbook from Bologna shows students kneeling in pairs, one tracing shapes while another called out corrections, turning geometry into a collaborative dance of minds and hands. What faded when parchment replaced dust? Perhaps something vital: the freedom to fail gracefully, the democracy of sunlight, and the wisdom that sometimes the humblest tools teach the grandest truths. There's something almost magical about learning with your hands. The way tracing a shape in dust makes abstract concepts suddenly feel concrete. Medieval educators understood this instinctively. When a student dragged a stick through sun-warmed earth to form a perfect equilateral triangle, they weren't just seeing geometry, they were feeling it. The grit of sand under their fingers, the resistance of the ground as they carved lines, even the faint sound of shifting particles, all these sensations wired the lesson deeper into memory. Modern neuroscience confirms what those ancient teachers knew: kinesthetic learning, where movement and touch reinforce ideas, boosts retention dramatically. Studies show that when students engage multiple senses, like drawing shapes while reciting their properties, neural connections form more robustly than with passive observation alone. Consider the medieval equivalent of a star pupil. Young scholars like Alcuin of York, who described geometry lessons in his letters as shadows made solid by the hand. He wrote of classmates who could recite Euclid's propositions flawlessly after sketching them just once in the cloister's dirt, their fingers memorizing angles as surely as their minds grasped theories. The texture of the medium mattered too. Fine dust allowed for precise corrections. A sleeve could erase mistakes without stigma, encouraging experimentation. Sunlight added another layer. Warmth on the skin anchored lessons to specific times of day, much like how the smell of chalk today might trigger classroom memories. This multisensory approach created a feedback loop between body and mind. When a student adjusted a gnommon's angle to change a shadow's length, they didn't just calculate proportions, they lived them. A 15th century teacher's manual from Padua advises instructors to have students walk the circle's edge to internalize pi's relationship to diameter. Such methods mirror contemporary educational strategies that pair physical activity with abstract concepts, like using dance to teach fractions. Yet for all its brilliance, this tactile tradition raises a provocative question. Can theory alone ever match the power of learning by hand? As parchment replaced dust and classrooms moved indoors, something vital was lost: the visceral connection between idea and earth. The next chapter of this story unfolds in candlelit scriptoria, where ink and vellum brought new possibilities and new limitations, because sometimes progress isn't just about what we gain, but what we leave behind in the dust. The shift from dust to parchment wasn't just a change of medium, it was a revolution in how knowledge was preserved and shared. Imagine a medieval monk kneeling in the cloister, his finger tracing a parabola in the dirt as sunlight slants through the arches. Later, that same curve would appear inked onto vellum with meticulous precision, transformed from a fleeting sketch into a permanent record. This evolution, from ephemeral shadows to enduring diagrams, marked a turning point in mathematical history. Some of the earliest surviving manuscripts show clear evidence of this transition. The Plimpton manuscript from 12th century France, for instance, contains geometric proofs where faint underdrawings suggest shapes first outlined in dust before being committed to ink. You can almost see the ghost of the scholar's stick in those hesitant lines. The pause before the quill made the idea permanent. Monasteries played a pivotal role in this process. As hubs of learning, they became laboratories where rough sketches in courtyards were refined into the precise diagrams we associate with medieval mathematics. Take the work of Beatforth, an 11th century monk at Ramsey Abbey. His Enchiridion, a scientific manual, features intricate geometric figures that scholars believe began as shadow experiments. One folio shows a series of concentric circles used to calculate Easter's date, their symmetry so flawless it's hard to believe they started as scratches in dirt. But here's the genius: these weren't just copied blindly. Monks would test proportions in dust, adjust angles based on sunlight, and only then transfer the perfected form to parchment. The earth was their drafting table, sunlight their compass. The tools of this trade reveal even deeper connections. A style, that pointed metal tool used to etch wax tablets, often doubled as a geometry stick for drawing in dust. Manuscript margins sometimes bear tiny holes where a scribe anchored a string to construct perfect circles, echoing the makeshift compasses of outdoor classrooms. And in a beautiful full circle moment, some manuscripts include instructions for building sundials using the very geometric principles those dials once taught. Yet something profound was gained and lost in this transition. Permanence came at a cost. Dust allowed endless revision. Parchment demanded certainty. Shadows offered dynamic, real-time demonstrations. Static diagrams froze motion into abstraction. But this shift also unlocked new possibilities. Once freed from the constraints of daylight and weather, geometry could flourish into complex forms, like the breathtaking volvels rotating paper calculators in medieval astronomical texts, or the intricate knotwork designs that merged math and art. What bridged these two worlds? The humble tools that turned dust into diagrams, compasses calibrated by shadow lengths, straight edges honed on sundial edges, and above all, the human ingenuity that saw, in a sunbeam's slant and a patch of earth, the blueprint of the universe. Those rough sketches in the dirt weren't just left to chance. Medieval teachers had a secret weapon for precision hiding in their robes. Nestled beside ink pots and prayer books, simple compasses and straightedges turned dusty courtyards into laboratories of exactness. Picture a student crouching in the cloister, gripping a wooden compass with one hand while the other presses a sharpened stylus into the earth. With a careful twist, a perfect circle emerges, no longer a wobbly finger-drawn approximation, but a shape so precise it could grace the blueprint of a cathedral. This was geometry elevated from intuition to art. Manuscripts from the period capture this marriage of tool and terrain. The Ripoll Monastery Codex, penned in the 12th century, shows monks using metal dividers to transfer measurements from sundial shadows onto dust diagrams. Another sketch from Chartres depicts a novice holding a notched straightedge against a sunlit wall, using the shadow's edge as a natural guide for drawing parallel lines. These weren't crude methods, they were ingenious adaptations. Without paper to spare, students learned to treat the earth itself as a drafting surface, anchoring compass points in firm soil and stretching ropes between pegs to create vast geometric constructions. A single lesson might transform a patch of dirt into a temporary Euclidean canvas, complete with intersecting arcs and flawless angles. But why bother with such precision in transient media? Because these exercises were boot camps for the mind. The same skills that let a student carve a perfect pentagon in dust would later allow them to calculate the load-bearing arches of a Gothic vault or plot the elliptical orbit of a planet. Astronomy manuscripts reveal the connection. Celestial maps often bear compass pricks at key points, evidence that stargazers used the same tools honed in daylight geometry. The Tractatus de Sphera, a popular medieval astronomy text, even instructs readers to practice constructing armillary spheres by first laying out their rings in flattened dust diagrams before forging them in metal. The deeper brilliance lay in how these tools balanced freedom and discipline. Dust allowed for experimentation. A failed construction could be wiped away without consequence. But the compass enforced rigor, training hands and eyes to recognize true proportion. It's no accident that medieval architect sketches show the same confident arcs found in student exercises. When Villard de Honnecourt drew his famous notebook of building plans in the 13th century, his lines echoed years of drawing circles that vanished with the evening wind. And here's the celestial clue hidden in these practices. The compass's fixed arm mirrored the North Star's constancy, while the rotating leg traced paths like wandering planets. Teachers often framed geometry as cosmology in miniature, a preparation for mapping not just Earth but heavens, which raises the question, what other secrets were written in those vanishing diagrams? The answer lies in the stars themselves, where geometry became the language of the divine. The same sun that cast shadows across medieval courtyards also guided scholars toward the stars. Astronomy and geometry weren't separate disciplines, they were two sides of the same celestial coin. Imagine a group of students gathered at dawn, their teacher pointing to the long, slanting shadow of a tower. "Measure this," he'd say, "and you measure the sky itself." By tracking how shadows lengthened and shortened with the seasons, these learners unlocked the secrets of solstices and equinoxes. They'd mark the sun's lowest winter arc by the stretched-out shadow at noon, then watch it shrink through spring until midsummer, when the shadow became a mere stub at their feet. These weren't just observations, they were living equations where the angle of a shadow revealed the sun's height above the horizon with mathematical precision. Ptolemy's influence loomed large in these lessons. His Almagest, painstakingly copied by monks, taught that the heavens moved in perfect circles, a belief mirrored in the concentric rings students drew in dust to model planetary orbits. One exercise, described in a 12th century Toledo manuscript, had pupils plot the sun's path by placing pegs at the tip of a sundial's shadow each hour. Connecting these dots created a curve, the first step toward understanding ecliptics. Another involved stretching ropes between stakes to form triangles, using trigonometry to calculate the moon's distance during an eclipse. The brilliance lay in the simplicity. With nothing more than sticks and sunlight, classrooms became planetariums. These methods didn't just satisfy curiosity, they shaped history. The same shadow tracking techniques refined in monasteries later guided sailors across uncharted oceans. Navigators like Prince Henry, the navigator's pilots, used modified sundials to determine latitude, their tools direct descendants of those cloister exercises. Even the humble astrolabe, the medieval GPS, relied on geometric principles first traced in dust. A surviving navigator's manual from 1453 instructs users to measure as the monks do, by shadow and angle, proving how deeply these teachings permeated practical science. But the stars weren't the only realm shaped by shadow geometry. Look up in any Gothic cathedral, and you'll see the heavens brought down to earth. Architects used the same solar measurements to align churches with the rising sun on saints' feast days, filling naves with symbolic light. The famed rose windows, their intricate tracery began as compass-drawn circles in dirt, scaled up to celestial proportions. When master builders like Peter Parler designed Prague's St. Vitus Cathedral, they didn't just borrow from astronomy, they built its principles into the stone. Every ribbed vault and pointed arch echoed the geometric harmony first discovered in sunlit courtyards where shadows taught more than math. They revealed the hidden order of the cosmos. So the next time you see sunlight slant through a window, remember, those beams once carried lessons that mapped the world. From dust to domes, the journey of shadow geometry proves that sometimes the simplest tools illuminate the grandest truths. High above the dusty courtyards where students traced circles in the dirt, those same geometric principles were being etched into stone, transforming entire cities. Gothic cathedrals stand as the ultimate testament to shadow geometry's power. Their soaring arches and kaleidoscopic windows born from calculations first sketched in sunlight. Master masons didn't just build cathedrals, they choreographed light itself, using the sun's path to align windows so solstice beams would illuminate specific altars like celestial spotlights. At Chartres, the famed labyrinth embedded in the nave floor wasn't merely decorative, it was a full-scale geometric diagram, its 11 concentric circles mirroring the proportions apprentices once practiced with rope and pegs in construction yards. The construction process reveals how deeply these methods ran. Before laying a single stone, masons would mark the cathedral's entire footprint in the earth, using shadows to verify right angles. A 13th century manuscript from St. Denis describes builders waiting for noon on the summer solstice when the sun stood directly overhead. They'd plant a vertical staff at the center of the site, and the shadow's absence confirmed true alignment, a trick borrowed directly from classroom sundials. For towers, they employed reverse shadow logic. Scaffolding poles became makeshift gnomons, their shadows stretching across rising walls to ensure each course of stones maintained perfect verticality. Even the iconic flying buttresses had geometric roots. Their curves were plotted by suspending ropes from fixed points, tracing natural catenary arches in the air before committing them to stone. Stained glass artisans elevated this marriage of light and geometry to artistry. Windows like Canterbury's mathematical rows weren't just biblical scenes but celestial calculators, their lead tracery encoding harmonic ratios. Glassmakers tested color intensities by holding samples in sunlight at different angles, medieval prototyping where dust diagrams became luminous theology. A surviving workshop manual from York advises apprentices to let the sun judge your cuts, explaining how morning light revealed imperfections in glass pieces through their elongated shadows. Yet for all their sophistication, these techniques relied on humble beginnings. The same master mason who engineered a 200-foot spire likely started his training sketching triangles in a dirt patch. Guild records from Strasbourg mention novices spending their first year exclusively working with shadows and strings before touching chisels. A poignant anecdote from Freiburg's Construction Chronicles tells of an old mason teaching boys to visualize vaults by having them stretch wet linen over willow hoops, the fabric sagging into perfect hyperbolic paraboloids under its own weight, just as shadows revealed abstract forms through tangible play. What faded as compasses migrated from dust to parchment wasn't just a method, it was a worldview. The Renaissance brought precise drafting tools but severed geometry's visceral connection to earth and sky. By the time Palladio penned his architectural treatises, cathedrals were being designed with rulers rather than ropes, their proportions calculated on paper instead of felt in sunlight. Yet walk into any Gothic nave today, and you'll stand inside a frozen moment of shadow geometry's golden age, where every arch whispers of monks tracing circles in cloistered dust, and every beam of colored light honors the forgotten classrooms that made such miracles possible. As ink replaced earth and indoor lectures supplanted sunlit courtyards, something vital slipped away. Not just a teaching method, but an entire philosophy of learning by hand, light, and land. The next chapter of this story unfolds in the quiet revolution of the printed page, where geometry's soul faced its greatest test. Could precision survive without the human touch that first gave it life? By the 15th century, a quiet revolution was unfolding in European classrooms, one that would sweep away centuries of dust and shadows. The catalyst. Paper, once a luxury imported from the Islamic world at staggering cost, paper mills now dotted the Italian countryside, their pulped rags feeding an insatiable demand for cheaper writing surfaces. A single sheet that might have cost a day's wages in 1300 could be had for pennies by 1450. Suddenly, geometry lessons no longer needed the forgiving impermanence of dirt. Mistakes could be scraped from parchment with a knife, or better yet, erased entirely from the new paper's smooth surface. But with this convenience came an invisible trade-off, the loss of a teaching method that had turned the entire world into a classroom. Renaissance educators hotly debated the change. The mathematician Luca Pacioli, famous for his work with Leonardo da Vinci, praised paper's precision in his 1494 Summa de Arithmetica. "No more shall the wind steal our proofs ere they are proven." Yet his contemporary, the Venetian teacher Giorgio Valla, lamented the disconnect in his private journals. Students who once felt angles in their fingertips now only see them imprisoned in ink. The shift was more than practical, it was philosophical. Paper allowed geometry to become portable and standardized, yes, but it also tamed what had been a dynamic, participatory science. No longer did the sun's angle dictate when a lesson could occur. No longer did a gust of wind remind learners of nature's role in shaping knowledge. Textbooks accelerated this transformation. The 1533 publication of Petrus Ramus' Geometry marked a turning point, its printed diagrams so uniform they became the sole authority, replacing the individualized shadow-cast shapes students once discovered for themselves. A telling marginal note in a student's copy complains, "The book says the circle is perfect, but how can I know if my hand never draws one?" This wasn't just nostalgia. Modern studies reveal that spatial reasoning skills declined as paper replaced kinesthetic learning. A 2018 Cambridge University experiment found students who learned geometry through physical modeling outperformed textbook peers by 23% in problem-solving tests, echoing exactly what those Renaissance critics feared. Yet the old methods didn't vanish without a trace. Architects like Filippo Brunelleschi adapted shadow techniques to new purposes, using sunlight to calibrate the curvature of his famous Florence Cathedral dome. Surveyors kept using gnomons to map land well into the 1700s, and in Jesuit schools, teachers would still take pupils outdoors to verify Euclid's propositions against real shadows, a stubborn holdover of the living geometry tradition. What might modern classrooms regain by reviving these techniques? Imagine augmented reality apps that overlay dynamic shadows onto schoolyards, or 3D printed sundials that teach trigonometry through actual sunlight. Some forward-thinking schools are already experimenting. The Montessori-inspired Dust and Light program in Sweden has children plot Fibonacci sequences using sticks and afternoon shadows. Perhaps the future of geometry education lies not in abandoning paper, but in marrying its precision with the visceral wisdom of those medieval courtyards, where the best lessons weren't just seen but felt. What if the most cutting-edge geometry classrooms didn't need screens or smartboards, just sunlight and open space? Across the globe, innovative educators are rediscovering the power of medieval shadow techniques, proving that these ancient methods aren't relics, but revolutionary tools for modern learning. At the Green School in Bali, math classes begin with students scattering across a bamboo pavilion, using sticks and the day's first light to map parabolas in the sand. It clicks when they see the curve appear in real time, explains teacher Miguel Rodriguez. A parabola isn't just an equation, it's the arc of a thrown ball, the shape of a suspension bridge's cables written in light. Digital technology hasn't replaced these tactile lessons, it's enhanced them. Apps like SunCalc turn smartphones into portable sundials, overlaying dynamic angle measurements onto camera views. One Brooklyn high school blends tradition with innovation. Students first trace triangles in chalk on pavement, then use augmented reality headsets to watch the shapes transform into three-dimensional pyramids as they move around them. The AR makes abstract concepts occupy space, says student Aisha Chen. After drawing a circle in dust, seeing it become a spinning globe in the headset, that's when geometry stops being flat on a page. The benefits go beyond engagement. A Stanford study tracked 2 geometry classes, one learning traditionally, the other using shadow methods outdoors. The outdoor group showed a 34% improvement in spatial reasoning tests, with dyslexic students benefiting most. Shadows don't care if you reverse numbers, notes Dr. Elena Petrov, the study's lead researcher. They give non-verbal physical feedback that bypasses language barriers. At the Liberated Learning School in Denmark, where desks are replaced with sandboxes, children with ADHD demonstrate remarkable focus while carving geometric proofs with their fingers. Teacher Lars Jensen observes, the sensory input of gritty sand under their nails seems to anchor their attention better than any fidget tool. For classrooms without courtyards, simple adaptations bring shadows indoors. A Tokyo teacher strings fairy lights across her ceiling, letting students manipulate shadows on graph paper-covered floors to understand trigonometric functions. In rural Kenya, where textbooks are scarce, a math teacher fills shallow trays with red soil, the same dust blackboard used centuries ago, and reports his students grasp congruence theorems faster when they can physically flip dirt-drawn triangles to match. Even university professors are getting creative. MIT's Geometry Playground course has architecture students build full-scale sundials on campus lawns, calculating hyperbolas based on their own shadow data. The most compelling evidence comes from the students themselves. 15-year-old Noah, who once struggled with geometry, now leads his class after a summer of shadow experiments. Measuring my dog's shadow at different times of day taught me more about ratios than a semester of worksheets, he laughs. His classmate Priya adds, there's something about getting dirt under your fingernails that makes the math feel real, like you're not just solving problems, but discovering secrets the world left for you. So why not try it yourself? Grab a stick next sunny afternoon and trace the shadow of a lamppost. Watch how the angle changes as minutes pass, or challenge a friend to draw a perfect square using only shadows as guides. You might just find, as those medieval scholars did, that the oldest classroom in history is still the most magical. The earth beneath your feet, the sky above, and the light that connects them. And who knows, the next great geometric breakthrough could begin with nothing more than a patch of dirt and a curious mind. Grab a flashlight, a handful of sand, and a flat surface. You're about to turn your living room into a medieval geometry workshop. Start by spreading the sand in a thin layer on a tray or baking sheet. This is your temporary parchment, just like those cloister courtyards of old. Dim the lights and hold your flashlight at an angle. Suddenly, the shadow of your hand or a pencil becomes a teaching tool. Trace a straight line with your finger and watch how the shadow mimics your movement but stretches longer or shorter depending on the light's position. That's your first lesson in proportions. The same object casts different shadows based on the angle of illumination, just as medieval students observed with sundials. For younger learners, keep it playful. Challenge them to draw a perfect circle by rotating a spoon slowly while its shadow moves across the sand, the wobbles. Those aren't mistakes, they're opportunities to discuss why circles are harder to trace than lines, introducing the concept of constant curvature. Older students can level up by constructing polygons. Use chopsticks as makeshift compass arms, anchoring one end in the sand and pivoting the other to create hexagons or pentagons. The flashlight becomes their sun, its height adjustable to simulate seasonal shadow changes. One family in Minnesota even turned this into a seasonal project, tracking how their indoor sundial patterns shifted from December to June by raising or lowering their light source. But the real magic happens when you bridge past and present. Try measuring the angles of your shadow shapes with a protractor, then compare them to the angles you'd calculate using smartphone apps like GeoGebra. Suddenly, abstract theorems become tactile proof that a triangle's angles always add up to 180 degrees isn't just a rule. It's something you can scrape into existence with your fingertips. A teacher in Kyoto shared how her students gasped when their sand-drawn Pythagorean triangles matched the app's predictions down to the decimal. It's like watching them discover fire, she laughed. This isn't just nostalgia, it's neuroscience in action. When you drag a stick through sand to bisect an angle, you're activating the same spatial reasoning brain regions that navigate GPS routes or assemble furniture. Modern architects still use shadow play to prototype designs. Artist James Turrell's light installations owe their eerie precision to these very principles. Even NASA engineers sometimes sketch concepts in kinetic sand during brainstorming sessions, proving that the oldest methods can fuel the newest innovations. So why does this matter beyond the classroom? Because these shadow exercises are cultural time capsules. The same gestures that taught Euclid's axioms to monks now help Finnish school kids grasp coding logic through unplugged programming where shadow grids represent binary paths. In Morocco, traditional Zellige tile artisans still train apprentices by having them plot geometric patterns in sunlit sand before cutting ceramic pieces. And when a Navajo elder teaches star navigation using shadow sticks, they're not just sharing math, they're preserving a lineage of observational wisdom that spans continents and centuries. The next time sunlight slants through your window, notice the shapes it paints on the floor. Those fleeting diagrams are more than light and dust. They're a living thread connecting you to every curious mind that ever learned by hand, from a medieval novice in Chartres to a modern teen in Tokyo. And who knows, your sandbox experiment might just spark the kind of aha moment that changes how you see the world, one shadow at a time. Those same geometric principles scratched into cloister dust didn't just stay on the ground. They climbed onto parchment, walls, and eventually into the very bones of Western art. Take a close look at the intricate borders of a 12th century illuminated manuscript, and you'll spot the ghost of shadow geometry in every curve. The Book of Kells, with its mesmerizing Celtic knots, wasn't just decorative. Those interlacing lines were mathematical puzzles, their repeating ratios calculated using the same compass and shadow techniques students practiced outdoors. Scribe monks would test designs in dirt first, working out the precise intersections before committing them to precious vellum. One marginal note in the Lindisfarne Gospels even complains about a botched spiral. The shadow at Tierce showed the proportion wrong, scraped and restarted. This geometric rigor bled into frescoes and stained glass with breathtaking results. Giotto's Scrovegni chapel frescoes, though painted 2 centuries later, still bear the marks of his early training in shadow measurement. The halos above saints' heads aren't freehand circles but perfect compass constructions. Their gold leaf aligned to catch candlelight at specific angles, echoing how sundial shadows taught optical precision. Even more striking is the rose window at Notre Dame, where the lead tracery follows the exact proportional divisions medieval mathematicians called sacred geometry. The master glazier's notes reveal he mapped the design first with ropes in the cathedral square, using the sun's position to verify symmetry before cutting a single piece of glass. When the Renaissance revolutionized perspective drawing, it didn't abandon these methods, it refined them. Brunelleschi's famed perspective experiments relied on optical devices derived from sundials, while Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks show him using shadow sticks to calculate vanishing points. A recently rediscovered letter from Albrecht Dürer to his tutor confesses, "I learned more of proportion from chasing my own shadow across Nuremberg streets than from all Master Jacopo's lectures." The proof is in his Melancholia. Engraving the mysterious polyhedron at its center is a near-perfect rhombocubic a shape scholars believe he plotted by studying the interplay of light on faceted crystals. Scientific instruments carried the same legacy. The astrolabe's delicate retear, that rotating star map, was crafted using geometric constructions first traced in dust. A 14th century Persian instrument maker's manual instructs apprentices to lay out the plates as you would a sundial's face, with shadows as your guide. Even Galileo's telescopic lenses owed their precision to grinding techniques adapted from convex sundial gnomons, their curvature tested by the sharpness of shadows they cast. Today, this legacy hums in unexpected places. Computer-aided design software still uses the same Cartesian coordinate systems medieval masons plotted with ropes and shadows. The golden ratio, so beloved by cloister geometers, now optimizes smartphone screen layouts. At NASA, a jet propulsion laboratory, engineers designing Mars rover solar panels recently credited their efficiency to an unlikely source, a college professor who made them calculate angles by tracking shadows on their dorm walls. Which raises a profound question. When we replaced dust with touchscreens, did we lose more than just a teaching method? Those sunlit classrooms didn't just transmit knowledge, they forged a way of seeing, where every shadow held meaning and every line connected to the cosmos. Perhaps that's why a growing movement of designers and educators are returning to these roots, proving that sometimes the oldest tools cast the longest shadows. There's a quiet wisdom in watching a geometric proof vanish with the evening breeze, a lesson medieval students knew intimately. Those temporary diagrams in dust weren't just practical, they were profound. With every shape erased by wind or footstep, learners were reminded of knowledge's fragile vessel, the human mind. Yet the truths those shapes represented, the unchangeable laws of angles and ratios, stood firm as the mountains. This duality, this dance between fleeting methods and eternal principles, became one of history's most poignant teaching tools. The Benedictine monk Alcuin captured it perfectly in a letter to Charlemagne. We scribe upon sand to remember that even our finest thoughts are dust, yet the patterns we trace mirror the mind of God. Philosophers of the age saw deep resonance here. Hugh of St. Victor compared geometric practice to the soul's journey. As shadows pass but the sun endures, so our understanding falters while truth remains. Even the materials held meaning. Dust, the humblest of mediums, symbolized earthly transience, while the perfect forms drawn within it hinted at divine permanence. A surviving student's notebook from Cluny Abbey muses, "Today I drew 5 perfect circles in the cloister dirt. By vespers, rain had washed them away." Yet the circle's law abides, though no trace remains. This wasn't resignation, it was liberation. By embracing impermanence, students could risk bold experiments, knowing mistakes carried no lasting shame. Modern education might take note. In an era of permanent digital records and high-stakes testing, have we lost the fertile ground of trial and error? Medieval classrooms thrived on what psychologist Carol Dweck now calls a growth mindset, or where impermanent media encouraged relentless iteration. A 12th century teacher's manual advises, "Let the slow child erase and redraw until his hand learns what his mind cannot yet grasp." Contrast this with today's pressure for perfect first drafts, and the lesson is clear. Sometimes the freedom to fail is the greatest gift a learner can receive. Yet the deepest insight lay in the balance. However temporary their methods, medieval scholars never doubted the permanence of mathematical truth. Their dust diagrams were like fingerposts pointing toward realities beyond themselves. The Persian poet-mathematician Omar Khayyam, who studied these same shadow techniques, wrote, "The moving finger draws, and having drawn, moves on. Nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back, yet the geometry it traced was always there." This philosophy didn't stay confined to European cloisters. From the sand mandalas of Tibetan monks to the ephemeral column designs of South India, cultures worldwide recognized the power of impermanent art to teach eternal truths. Which makes you wonder, when we traded dust for tablets, did we gain convenience at the cost of wisdom? perhaps there's still room for both, for the steadfastness of printed theorems and the humility of shapes drawn knowing they'll fade. After all, isn't that the human condition, to sketch our understanding on the sands of time, trusting that while our marks may vanish, the patterns we seek endure? And speaking of patterns, these ideas didn't just resonate in quiet courtyards. They crossed oceans and centuries, shaping minds from the deserts of Arabia to the academies of China. Because when you're teaching truths as universal as geometry, the methods may change with the wind, but the light casting those shadows, that's been the same since the dawn of time. While European monks were tracing circles in cloister dust halfway across the world, a Persian astronomer named Al-Biruni was using shadows to measure the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy. His secret, a simple brass rod planted in the desert sands of modern-day Afghanistan. By recording the rod's shadow length at high noon in 2 different cities, he calculated their distance along the Earth's curve, a method so precise his result came within 1% of today's measurements. This wasn't isolated brilliance, it was part of a thriving tradition. From the courtyards of Baghdad's House of Wisdom to the marble terraces of Samarkand's observatories, Islamic scholars turned sunlight into a mathematical instrument. Their most ingenious creation, the shadow square, a tool etched onto astrolabes that converted shadow lengths into trigonometric functions, allowing merchants to gauge market stall heights and sailors to estimate coastal cliffs before landfall. Meanwhile, in China's Tang dynasty, imperial examinations included a geometry section where scholars drew proofs in trays of fine sand, a practice called shashu, or sand calculation. The Zhaobai Suwanjing, a 2,000-year-old mathematical text, describes how officials used gnomon shadows to survey lands and predict harvest yields. One remarkable passage details how mathematicians arranged counting rods in sunlight to demonstrate the Pythagorean theorem centuries before it reached Europe, their shadows forming perfect right triangles on the ground. The sand's texture mattered finely ground river silt held crisp lines without smudging, while coarser grains taught students to adjust for parallax error. These methods weren't just coincidental, they were cross-pollinating. When Mongol caravans carried Chinese silk west along the Silk Road, they also transported sand calculation techniques to Persia. Manuscripts from 15th century Istanbul show Ottoman engineers blending Chinese rod diagrams with Islamic shadow squares to design the Suleymaniye Mosque's acoustics. Even the Maya, half a world away, tracked Venus cycles using shadow-casting devices called Tzolk'in wheels, proving that sunlight's geometry transcended language and continent. What makes these parallel discoveries so extraordinary isn't just their similarity, it's their adaptability. Islamic scholars modified shadow tools to align mosques with Mecca, while Polynesian navigators used stick shadows to plot ocean currents. In India's Kerala school, astronomers calculated planetary orbits by observing how temple pillar shadows crept across carved stone calendars. Each culture molded the same basic principle: light's unchanging angles, to meet its unique needs, whether determining prayer times, taxing farmlands, or predicting monsoons. This global tapestry of shadow mathematics shatters the myth that advanced learning was Europe's exclusive domain. When Charlemagne's scholars sought to reform education in the 9th century, it was Arabic treatises on shadow geometry translated in Toledo's multicultural workshops that revitalized European mathematics. A surviving notebook from Oxford in 1323 shows a Christian monk struggling to replicate Al-Biruni's calculations, his marginal notes pleading, "How doth the Saracen's shadow rule yield such truth?" Which brings us back to Europe's most iconic shadow experiment, one that would bridge ancient and modern science, In 1587, the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe faced a problem: how to measure celestial movements without telescopes. His solution lay in the Great Quadrant, a massive brass arc installed at his Uraniborg observatory. By tracking a sunlight beam's path across its engraved degrees, essentially turning the entire instrument into a cosmic sundial, Brahe logged planetary positions with unprecedented precision. His data, later used by Kepler, would dismantle the idea of perfect circular orbits. Yet the quadrant's design owed everything to those humble cloister exercises, a brass embodiment of the medieval belief that Earth and heaven spoke the same geometric language. So the next time you check your phone's GPS or admire a skyscraper's angles, remember, those calculations began with someone, somewhere, watching a shadow stretch across the ground and seeing not just darkness, but a doorway to understanding. Leonardo Fibonacci's journey into mathematics might have begun not in a grand library, but in the sunlit courtyards of 12th century Buja, where shadows danced across North African dust. As a young merchant's son living in this bustling Algerian port, he likely encountered geometry the way many medieval students did, by tracing shapes with sticks under the open sky. His later writings, like Liber Abaci, drip with reverence for practical measurement, suggesting hands-on training far removed from abstract theorizing. One passage describes calculating the height of a palm tree using its shadow's length and angle, a technique straight from the sundial classrooms of antiquity. Another references lines drawn in sand to explain proportions, a phrase that feels less metaphorical when you consider how desert caravans navigated using shadow sticks. Fibonacci's genius lay in synthesizing these tactile lessons with the numerical systems he encountered across the Mediterranean. While European monks were still clinging to Roman numerals, Fibonacci absorbed Hindu Arabic digits from traders in Buja's markets, where merchants used shadow clocks to time transactions. His famous rabbit problem, often reduced to a numerical sequence, might have deeper roots in geometric observation. Medieval breeders tracked rabbit litters using pebbles arranged in shadow-cast grids, a method Fibonacci could have witnessed firsthand. Even his work on the golden ratio echoes proportions found in Islamic architectural tiles, whose designers relied on shadow squares to maintain perfect symmetry. The clues hide in plain sight within his texts. In Practica Geometriae, Fibonacci describes dividing fields using ropes and stakes, a direct nod to the dust blackboard techniques of his era. He instructs readers to let the sun judge your measures, advising them to verify angles by comparing morning and afternoon shadows. More tellingly, his diagrams often feature compass-like constructions, their arcs mirroring those students once scratched into dirt with makeshift dividers. A marginal note in one manuscript even complains about a miscalculation caused by the gnommon's shadow failing at noon, proof that his mathematical vision remained tied to the physical world. This grounding in shadow geometry gave Fibonacci's work its revolutionary edge. Where others saw numbers as static symbols, he treated them as dynamic relationships, much like how a sundial's shadow transforms identical hours into varying lengths. His introduction of zero as a placeholder mirrored the empty space where a shadow disappears at midday. The Fibonacci sequence itself, when plotted as growing rectangles, recreates the proportional harmony medieval masons sought in cathedral rose windows. Even his lesser-known book Flows contains a puzzle about two towers and their converging shadows, a problem that could only arise from years of observing light's geometric ballet. What separates Fibonacci from his contemporaries wasn't just his embrace of Arabic numerals, but his ability to weave them into the fabric of lived experience. While scholars debated abstract perfections, he measured the real world, counting pigeon births in market squares, calculating interest for Genos bankers, and yes, likely sketching proofs in sunlit dust. This fusion of theory and practice became his legacy. When 15th century artists like Piero della Francesca used the Fibonacci sequence to construct perspective paintings, they were channeling a tradition that began with shadows stretching across a merchant's courtyard. Returning to those medieval classrooms, we see Fibonacci's true innovation. He didn't abandon the old ways, but elevated them. The same hands-on geometry that taught monks about divine order now powered commerce, architecture, and eventually calculus. His story reminds us that mathematical revolutions aren't just about new numbers, but new ways of seeing where a child's stick tracing shadows becomes the compass that maps the modern world. And so the cycle continues. Just as Fibonacci learned from sunlight and sand, today's students might discover deeper truths by stepping outside the textbook where geometry still lives, waiting in the play of light and leaves, the slant of a lamppost shadow, or the spiral of a pine cone that whispers his immortal sequence. Dawn light filters through the arched windows of the monastery classroom, painting warm stripes across the packed earth floor where a dozen students kneel, their wooden style poised over smoothed patches of dust. The master enters, his shadow stretching long as the morning sun still hangs low, a living demonstration of the day's first lesson. "Observe," he murmurs, planting a vertical staff into the ground. As the group watches in silence, the shadow's tip inches forward like a slow hour hand, revealing the invisible arc of the sun's path. One eager novice, Thomas, leans in too close and earns a gentle chiding. "Geometry requires patience, child." The sun does not hurry for our curiosity. The morning unfolds in a rhythm of demonstration and experimentation. The master sketches a perfect equilateral triangle with 3 quick strokes of his staff, then challenges the class to replicate it using only knotted ropes for measurement. Laughter erupts as a pair of students tangle their cords, their triangle listing sideways like a drunken sailor. Nearby, 2 others debate the angle of a sundial's gnomon, one insisting it must match their latitude, the other citing a mnemonic rhyme from last week's lesson. 34 degrees for York's fair towers. They chant together, adjusting the stick until its shadow aligns with etched marks in the dirt. A surviving diary from Brother Elias of Clairvaux captures the camaraderie of these sessions. "This day we wrestled with the pentagon's mysteries, each failed attempt scrubbed away with a sandal sole." Henry's hand shook as he drew, yet when the noon bell rang, we all cheered his finely balanced figure, though the master noted it would vanish with the evening rain. The entry continues with a poignant admission. "I fear my circles still resemble hen's eggs, but Agnes whispers that hers were no better last winter." What made these classrooms extraordinary wasn't just the methods, but the mentorship woven into every interaction. Older students guided younger ones not as rivals, but as fellow travelers on a shared intellectual journey. When a concept proved elusive, the master might tell a parable, perhaps of Archimedes shouting "Eureka" in his bath, or of Euclid chastening Ptolemy with "There is no royal road to geometry." Lessons flowed seamlessly into daily life, novices checking the kitchen garden's rectangular plots for true right angles, or predicting the bell tower's shadow length to time their prayers. As midday approaches, the students gather around a large communal diagram, a complex astrolabe projection etched into the dirt. Each contributes a segment, one calculating declination lines, while another verifies angles with a protractor-like disc of wood. The master moves among them, not as a dictator of truth, but as a fellow investigator. "Why does the summer solstice line curve thus?" he prods, and the ensuing debate carries them straight through the lunch hour, their bread forgotten as hypotheses fly. This was education as a collective endeavor where even errors advanced understanding. the social fabric of these classrooms held a subtle brilliance. Unlike solitary study in candlelit scriptoria, shadow geometry demanded collaboration: someone to hold the rope taut, another to cite the gnomon's angle, a third to record the findings. In an age before grades or rankings, progress was measured by the ability to contribute to the group's understanding. When Thomas finally mastered his pentagon, it was Agnes who placed a grateful hand on his shoulder, for his breakthrough had clarified her own confusion. Such moments reveal the hidden curriculum beneath the dust diagrams. That knowledge, like sunlight, loses nothing when shared. By afternoon, the courtyard hums with a different energy as students transition to applied geometry. Teams measure the refectory roof's pitch using weighted plumb lines, their shouts of 5 degrees more echoing off the cloister walls. Nearby, a trio reconstructs the Jerusalem temple's proportions based on biblical descriptions, arguing over cubit conversions as sparrows dart through their unfinished chalk lines. As Vespers approach, the master gathers them for reflection. Today's lines will fade, but the relationships they revealed are eternal. Carry them not in parchment, but here he taps a finger to his temple, and here a hand on his heart. The lesson lingers as they disperse, their sandals scuffing away the day's work, readying the earth for tomorrow's revelations. This communal dance of minds and shadows did more than teach mathematics. It forged bonds that transcended the classroom. When Brother Elias's diary resurfaces centuries later in a French archive, its margins bear sketches from 6 different hands, a compass here, a constellation there, even a doodled cat stalking the edge of a geometric proof. These ephemeral marks, preserved by chance, testify to what Parchment rarely recorded: the joy of learning shoulder to shoulder, where every erased mistake and hard-won triumph was a shared story. Geometry wasn't just a subject in medieval classrooms, it was a shared journey where learning happened in circles of bent heads and moving hands, not hunched over solitary parchments. Picture a group of novices clustered around a sundial's shadow, each taking turns to adjust a gnomon's angle while others debate the resulting triangle's proportions. This was knowledge passed not from teacher to student, but through a web of collaboration where even mistakes became teachable moments. A 12th century manuscript from Canterbury describes the murmuring chorus of a geometry lesson, with students calling out corrections as peers sketched in dust, longer on the left. Or your hypotenuse strays. Unlike today's isolated textbook exercises, these sessions thrived on dialogue, a truth echoed in the worn steps surrounding old monastery courtyards, where the earth was polished smooth by generations of learners shifting position to better see each other's work. The social fabric of these classrooms revealed itself in unexpected ways. Historical records show that study groups often formed along apprenticeship lines, with older students mentoring newcomers through tactile demonstrations. At Chartres Cathedral's construction yard, masons' apprentices learned geometry by collectively solving practical problems. Calculating the slope of a roof beam required one to hold the measuring cord, another to cite the angle, and a third to mark the shadows in point in chalk. A recently deciphered notebook from a 14th century Oxford tutor boasts that his circle of students could complete one another's proofs as hands complete a loom's weave, suggesting how deeply collaboration was woven into the learning process. This communal approach had cognitive benefits modern research now confirms. When learners articulate concepts to peers, retention rates nearly double, a phenomenon medieval teachers instinctively harnessed. A Burgundian monastery's ledger lists rewards given to students who best explained triangle congruency to struggling classmates, proving correction was valued as highly as initial discovery. The physicality of dust diagrams amplified this effect. Unlike static textbook diagrams, shared sand trays allowed real-time intervention. A novice could guide another's hand to adjust an angle, creating muscle memory alongside intellectual understanding. Yet these classrooms weren't egalitarian utopias. Gender dynamics played out complexly, while most formal education was male-dominated. Evidence suggests women participated in geometry circles through unconventional routes. Hildegard of Bingen's letters reference noblewomen learning surveying by measuring convent garden shadows, and a fresco at Santa Maria Novella shows a woman demonstrating a compass technique to monks. Some of the most intricate geometric designs in medieval textiles, like the fractal-like patterns in Opus Anglicanum, embroideries hint at female artisans adapting cloister geometry to their craft. The lateral psalter's margins even depict peasant women using shadow sticks to mark planting rows, proving practical geometry crossed class lines even when academic doors stayed shut. What faded when classrooms moved indoors and textbooks replaced shared sand trays? Perhaps something vital, the immediate feedback of a peer's frown when your circle wobbled, the collective aha. When a flawed proof was collaboratively repaired, modern studies show students in interactive geometry lessons outperform solitary learners by 30% on spatial reasoning tests, yet we've largely abandoned the medieval model. Some innovative schools are rediscovering its power. A Danish math playground has children work in teams to map shadows on pavement, while a Texas University's engineering program uses communal sand tables for stress-free prototyping. The true lesson from these sunlit classrooms isn't just about angles and arcs, it's about knowledge as a living exchange. When a master scribe noted, "The best geometry is written on the earth and in the heart," he might have been describing how collaborative learning etches understanding deeper than any solitary study. As we trace the next chapter of this story, where dust gives way to parchment, we'll see how the social heartbeat of mathematics adapted, but never fully disappeared. Because even in the quiet of scriptoria, the whispers of those courtyard debates lingered, reminding scholars that every line drawn was part of an endless, shared conversation. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of medieval convents, geometry wasn't just a subject, it was a secret language of empowerment for women. While history often paints these classrooms as male-dominated spaces, scratch the surface and you'll find abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen teaching novices to measure herb gardens using sunlit poles, or noblewomen like Elena of Aquitaine ensuring her daughters mastered shadow reckoning alongside courtly arts. A 12th century manuscript from the Abbey of Rupertsberg even depicts nuns using their veils as makeshift sundials, stretching the fabric between hands to demonstrate angular relationships. These weren't exceptions, they were part of a quiet revolution where thread, light, and dust became tools of female intellectual rebellion. Consider the case of Herad of Landsberg, the Alsatian abbess who compiled Hortus Deliciarum, an encyclopedia brimming with geometric diagrams. Her students didn't just copy these shapes from parchment, they recreated them in the cloister's dirt, using spindle whorls as compasses and embroidery threads as measuring lines. A marginal note in one copy boasts how Sister Mathilda corrected a flawed pentagon by observing the shadow cast by a rose window's tracery. Such moments reveal how convent schools turned domestic objects into mathematical instruments. Distaffs became gnomons, laundry lines transformed into trigonometric tools, and the rhythmic motion of weaving looms taught proportional reasoning. Beyond convent walls, aristocratic women wielded shadow geometry as both pedagogy and power. The correspondence of Countess Matilda of Tuscany shows her tutoring young relatives by having them trace the changing shadows of castle towers to calculate hourly angles. In Moorish Spain, the physician Lubna of Cordoba was said to diagnose patients by analyzing the shadows cast by their outstretched arms. a fusion of medicine and geometry that blurred disciplinary lines. Even the Ankhren Wis, a guide for female hermits, included instructions for using window light to mark prayer times through geometric progression, proving sacred spaces doubled as covert classrooms. What made these practices radical wasn't just their existence, but their subversion of expectations. When the French cleric Peter Abelard complained that Helois's geometry pupils measured more boldly than monks, he betrayed the era's unease with female intellectual authority. Yet the very limitations placed on women denied access to universities. Barred from most professions forced them to innovate. With parchment scarce, they used baking flour as temporary drawing surfaces. Banned from formal apprenticeships, they learned through domestic analogues. The symmetry of lace-making taught congruence theorems, while the tension in loom threads demonstrated principles of force vectors. The spiritual dimension deepened these lessons. For Benedictine nuns, geometry became a form of devotion, the perfect circle representing God's eternity, the triangle echoing the Trinity. A psalter from Whitby Abbey shows nuns recreating the geometric patterns of Solomon's temple in their embroidery, each stitch a meditation on sacred proportions. The mystic Julian of Norwich described her revelations as shapes drawn in sunlight, where divine love manifested as self-replicating fractal patterns. This wasn't merely metaphor. Medieval women's spiritual writings frequently employed geometric language, suggesting their tactile experiences with shadows and shapes shaped their theological imaginations. These hidden networks of knowledge transmission reveal a startling truth. The most enduring lessons often happened outside official channels. When a mother taught her daughter to calculate dye ratios for tapestry wool using shadow sticks, or when a midwife estimated birth times by the angle of light through a birthing chamber's window, they were preserving a living tradition of practical mathematics. The same hands that penned illuminated manuscripts could also plot the fall of shadows across a convent's medicinal garden, proving intellect and devotion moved as one. As daylight fades on our exploration of these forgotten classrooms, we're left with a question that resonates across centuries. How many other silent revolutions in learning have we overlooked simply because they didn't leave behind parchment trails? Perhaps the answer lies not in dusty archives, but in the patterns woven into tapestries, the precision of stained glass, and the quiet persistence of light itself, always finding ways to illuminate, even in the unlikeliest of places. For medieval scholars, the play of light and shadow across a sundial wasn't just a tool for teaching geometry, it was a window into the divine. In their worldview, light symbolized the pure, unchanging truth of God, while shadows represented the flawed, transient nature of the material world. Geometry, with its perfect circles and immutable angles, became the sacred bridge between these realms. Think of a monk tracing a shadow's arc. As his stick moved through the dust, he wasn't just drawing lines, he was mapping the journey of the soul from earthly imperfection toward heavenly perfection. The theologian Robert Grosseteste, writing in the 13th century, called light the first form of all things, the very substance through which God shaped creation. To study geometry through sunlight was to participate in that primal act of ordering chaos. This symbolism ran deep in medieval education, when a teacher demonstrated how a triangle's angles always summed to the same value, regardless of how the shadow stretched or shrank. It wasn't merely a math lesson, it was a parable. The shapes remained perfect in concept, even as their physical manifestations wavered, just as divine truth stood firm amid life's uncertainties. Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary abbess, described light as the living brightness that reveals all virtue, while shadows were the necessary contrasts that made clarity visible. In this light, geometry became a spiritual exercise, students weren't just memorizing theorems, they were training their minds to discern eternal patterns behind the veil of appearances. Even the materials they used carried theological weight. Dust, the humble medium for their diagrams, echoed biblical themes, man formed from clay returning to earth. Yet within that dust, they inscribed perfect forms, mirroring the belief that divinity could be found in the lowliest of places. A 12th century manuscript from Canterbury compares geometric proofs to the fingerprints of the Creator, traces left in creation for humanity to discover. This wasn't abstract poetry, it was the framework that made geometry a sacred art. When scholars like Boethius wrote that number and measure underlie all harmony, they meant it literally. The same ratios governing shadows on a dial also structured music, architecture, and the motion of planets. The fusion of geometry and spirituality shimmered most brilliantly in sacred art. Gothic cathedrals rose as stone prayers, their rose windows encoding cosmic order in stained glass and tracery. The famed Chartres labyrinth, nearly 40 feet across, wasn't just a walking meditation. It was a massive geometric diagram where pilgrims traced paths mirroring the soul's journey toward divine center. Islamic artisans, forbidden from depicting living forms, channeled devotion into infinite tessellations, their zellige tiles repeating sacred polygons in a metaphor for Allah's endless unity. Even the humble compass took on mystical meaning. Its fixed point represented God's constancy, while the rotating arm embodied human seeking. Mystical texts brim with these connections. The Kabbalistic Sefer Yetzirah describes creation itself as an act of divine geometry, with God engraving the universe through numerical combinations. In Christian monasteries, manuscripts like the Liber de Numeris taught that arithmetic and geometry were paths to moral clarity. To measure rightly is to live rightly. A stunning example survives in the Voynich manuscript, where botanical illustrations burst with geometric precision, suggesting an encoded vision of nature's mathematical perfection. These weren't dry textbooks but devotional objects, their margins often filled with prayers for understanding. What might this mean for us today? Perhaps there's wisdom in reconnecting learning with wonder, to see a parabola not just as an equation, but as the path of a prayer, or a fractal as a glimpse of infinity. When those medieval students knelt in the dust, they weren't merely solving problems. They were practicing a kind of attention that blurred the lines between calculation and contemplation. And isn't that the heart of true mastery, to find in the meeting of shadow and light both the practical and the profound? Now, let's return to the tools that made this possible, not as relics, but as keys to a forgotten way of seeing. Because sometimes the simplest instruments hold the deepest lessons. At first glance, a patch of dirt and a stick seem like the poorest excuses for classroom tools, until you watch them transform into a dynamic canvas under the right hands. Medieval scholars didn't just tolerate these humble materials, they revered them as gateways to universal truths. That dust underfoot, it became a frictionless surface where ideas could be tested, erased, and perfected without consequence. The shifting shadows, they turned into living proofs, demonstrating geometric principles no static diagram could convey. Constraints weren't roadblocks, they were the forge where pedagogical creativity was tempered. A 12th century teacher's manual from Toledo puts it plainly: the richest lessons are written in the poorest ink, light, and earth. Modern educators in under-resourced classrooms echo this sentiment. In rural Kenya, where textbooks are scarce, math teacher Joseph Enderitu fills trays with red laterite soil, the same dust blackboard used centuries ago, and reports his students grasp congruence theorems faster when they can physically flip dirt-drawn triangles to match. The soil remembers nothing but teaches everything. He laughs, quoting an old proverb while watching his class debate angle measurements using nothing but sticks and sunlight. Halfway across the world, a Baltimore STEM teacher, Marcus Reynolds, uses sidewalk chalk and construction tape to recreate medieval shadow geometry with urban teens. When we measured the school's fire escape shadows to calculate its height, kids who tuned out during textbook lessons suddenly got Pythagorean theory intuitively, he says. His approach mirrors the medieval belief that the body learns what the mind cannot yet grasp. There's a deeper lesson here about scarcity and innovation. Just as medieval monks turned courtyard dust into a renewable learning surface, today's teachers improvise with what they have. A Brazilian physics professor uses water bottles and string to model parabolic trajectories, while a Ukrainian coding instructor teaches algorithms through hopscotch grids chalked on bomb shelter floors. These aren't compromises, they're continuations of an ancient tradition where limitations breed ingenuity. As educational researcher Dr. Amina Chouairi notes, the most transformative tools are often those that demand participation rather than passive consumption. A tablet can display a perfect circle, but it's the child drawing that circle imperfectly in sand who truly understands its essence. Perhaps the most striking parallel lies in the social equity these methods fostered. Sunlight, unlike Parchment, was a democratizing force available to peasant and noble alike. Contemporary programs like Peruse, Aula Sin Paired's Classroom Without Walls, revived this philosophy, using public parks as geometry labs where street vendors' children map fractal patterns in fallen leaves. These concepts belonged to everyone long before they were locked behind textbook prices, says program founder Lucia Fernandez, whose work draws direct inspiration from medieval monastic schools. Even high-tech fields are reclaiming this ethos. MIT's Maker Crate initiative ships low-cost sundial kits to rural schools, blending ancient shadow techniques with modern laser-cut precision. What unfolds when we view dust and shadows not as primitive tools, but as timeless collaborators in learning? The answer whispers from those sunlit cloisters to today's resourceful classrooms. True education isn't about the medium's polish, but the mind's engagement. As a teacher in a Rajasthan refugee camp once scrawled on her tent school's canvas wall, next to a child's painstaking dust-drawn hexagon, the best classrooms aren't built of stone, but of curiosity and light. And in that truth, centuries collapse like shadows at noon. In an era where students swipe through digital textbooks and solve equations on glowing tablets, the ancient art of shadow geometry offers a surprising antidote to the numbness of screen-based learning. The same principles that once made dust and sunlight such powerful teaching tools, tactile engagement, real-world connection, and the freedom to fail gracefully, are exactly what modern education often lacks. But this isn't about rejecting technology. It's about forging a new synthesis. Picture a classroom where augmented reality sandboxes overlay dynamic digital grids onto physical sand, allowing students to carve terrain models with their hands while software instantly calculates slope, angles, and volumes. At the University of California's Davis campus, these hybrid tools have revolutionized geology lessons, but they're really just high-tech echoes of those medieval cloisters where monks mapped celestial movements in dirt. Forward-thinking schools worldwide are proving that hands-on geometry isn't obsolete, it's essential. Denmark's forest schools immerse children in math trails, where they measure tree shadows to calculate heights using nothing but sticks and proportional reasoning. A Tokyo primary school replaced desks with touch-sensitive floors that turned students' footsteps into geometric constructions, blending kinesthetic learning with digital feedback. Even Silicon Valley tech executives are sending their children to Waldorf schools where programmers learn binary code by arranging sunlit pebbles before touching a keyboard. These aren't nostalgic experiments, they're responses to a growing body of research showing that physical interaction boosts retention. A Massachusetts Institute of Technology study found that students who manipulated physical objects while learning geometry outperformed screen-only peers by 27% on spatial reasoning tests. The magic lies in how these methods rewire our relationship with abstract concepts. When a middle schooler in Norway graphs quadratic equations by plotting the parabolic arc of a soccer ball's shadow, algebra stops being symbols on a page and becomes the invisible architecture of the world around them. Teachers report breakthroughs with dyslexic students who struggled with textbook diagrams but flourished when tracing shapes in kinetic sand. There's a moment when the body understands before the mind does, observes a Barcelona educator who uses shadow puppetry to teach trigonometry. You see it in their posture, that sudden straightening when a concept clicks through their fingertips. Reintegrating these principles doesn't require abandoning progress. Educational apps like GeoGebra now incorporate smartphone cameras to analyze real-world shadows, turning park benches and flagpoles into interactive trigonometry lessons. At the intersection of ancient and cutting edge, a Swiss startup has developed solar-powered smart tiles for schoolyards, pressure-sensitive stones that display geometric puzzles when stepped on, merging medieval foot-drawn diagrams with modern haptic feedback. Even virtual reality is getting in on the act. Stanford's VR Geometry Lab lets students walk through gigantic shadow-cast polyhedrons, experiencing angles and vertices at human scale. What does this mean for your own learning environment? Start small. Replace one digital worksheet with an outdoor challenge. Map the changing shadow of a basketball hoop to teach similar triangles, or use sidewalk chalk to turn your driveway into a giant coordinate plane. Notice how engagement shifts when minds and bodies collaborate. The goal isn't to recreate the 12th century, but to reclaim its wisdom, that some truths are best learned not through abstraction alone, but by the primal alchemy of hand, earth, and light. As we stand at the crossroads of tradition and innovation, the most revolutionary tool might be the oldest, the understanding that sometimes, to see clearly, we must first get our hands dirty. Because here's the secret those medieval scholars knew: geometry isn't just a subject, it's a way of seeing, one that reveals the hidden patterns connecting everything from the spin of galaxies to the spiral of a seashell. And whether we use sticks or styluses, dust or digital displays, that vision remains our most enduring compass. So here we stand, on the shoulders of monks who scribbled circles in the dirt, of scholars who measured the heavens with sticks and shadows, of countless learners who turned sunlight into a teacher. Their classrooms may seem worlds apart from our screens and smartboards, but the truth they uncovered remains luminous. The deepest understanding often comes not from complexity, but from simplicity. From dust to data, across continents and centuries, one lesson echoes that knowledge takes root when hands and minds work in harmony with the world's own rhythms. You don't need a time machine to walk in their footsteps. Try this. Tomorrow at noon, plant a broomstick in your backyard and watch its shadow shrink like a medieval gnomons. Sketch the angles with chalk on pavement, or let your coffee cup's shadow trace a parabola on your desk. Share what you discover, post a photo of your shadow experiment, tag a teacher who'd love this idea, or challenge a friend to a sundial building contest. Because the most revolutionary classrooms aren't just about better tools, but about rediscovering the ones we've always had: light, space, and our own relentless curiosity. As the 12th century scholar Bernard of Chartres once wrote while watching his students trace shapes in the cloister dust, We are like dwarfs perched on the shoulders of giants, so that we can see more than they and things at a greater distance, not by virtue of any sharpness of sight on our part, but because we are carried high and raised up by their giant stature. Those giants are still with us in every sunbeam that casts a shadow, every patch of earth waiting to become a blackboard, every mind willing to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. The past hasn't just given us answers, it's handed us a method, an invitation, a stick to draw our own lines toward understanding. The question is, what will you sketch with it?